The distant wail of a woman's cry pierced the tranquil evening air of Hawthorne, Nevada, in the spring of 1876, a sound that would forever alter the course of two lives bound by fate and the harsh realities of the American frontier. The scream carried across the dusty Main Street, past the saloon where raucous laughter spilled onto the wooden boardwalk, beyond the general store with its hanging lanterns, and into the ears of a trail-weary cowboy who had only intended to pass through town. Jenna Zhang clutched her bruised side as she cowered in the corner of the small bedroom. Her dark hair fell in disarray around her shoulders, her once pristine dress now torn at the sleeve. 3 years of marriage to Thomas Reed had brought her nothing but misery, but tonight was different. Tonight, her father-in-law Harold Reed had joined his son in their regular punishment. No grandson again. Harold's weathered face contorted with disgust as he towered over her. 3 years and nothing but a miscarriage and a useless girl child that didn't survive the week. Thomas, her husband, stood by the doorway, a thin man with cruel eyes who had never once defended her against his family's expectations. "The Zhang blood is weak," he muttered. "My mother gave my father 4 sons." Jenna's mother-in-law, Margaret, watched from the hallway, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "In China, they would have sent you back to your family in disgrace," she said coldly, though Jenna had been born in San Francisco, the daughter of immigrants who had died in a fire when she was 16. "Please," Jenna whispered, raising her hands defensively as Harold advanced again. "I cannot control whether I bear sons or daughters." The back of Harold's hand connected with her cheek, sending her sprawling against the bedpost. "Worthless," he spat. "Thomas should take another wife, a proper American woman who can give him sons." The irony that they had specifically chosen her for her supposed submissive Oriental nature was not lost on Jenna, but pointing this out would only make things worse. She tasted blood on her lip as Thomas approached, belt in hand. "Perhaps another lesson will help," he said with cold determination. Jenna screamed again as the leather bit into her flesh, a sound of pure anguish that carried through the open window and into the twilight. Flynn Kavanaugh had been riding for 3 days straight, his tall frame weary in the saddle of his chestnut stallion, Mercury. At 32, the former Union soldier turned rancher had seen his fair share of cruelty during the war and in the decade that followed, but the sound that reached his ears as he rode down Hawthorne's Main Street chilled him to the bone. A woman's scream, followed by a man's angry shout, then another cry of pain. Flynn dismounted in one fluid motion, tethering Mercury to the hitching post outside the modest clapboard house from which the sounds emanated. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached the door, his boots heavy on the porch steps. He didn't bother knocking. The door yielded to his forceful push, revealing a startled older woman in the narrow hallway. "This is a private residence," Margaret Reed began indignantly. Flynn ignored her, following the sounds of struggle to a bedroom at the back of the house. The scene that greeted him made his blood boil. A young woman curled defensively on the floor, a belt-wielding man standing over her, and an older man with raised fists. "That's enough," Flynn's voice cut through the room like a knife, his gun now drawn but pointed at the floor. Thomas Reed whirled around, his face flushing with anger. "Get out of my house. This is between me and my wife." Flynn's eyes met Jenna's, seeing the terror and something else, a desperate plea. Blood trickled from her split lip, and purple bruises were already forming on her exposed arms. "Madam," Flynn said quietly, "do you wish to stay here?" For a moment, the room fell silent. Jenna looked from Flynn to her husband, to her in-laws, people who had made her life a living hell for 3 years, a life that would likely end at their hands if she stayed. "No," she whispered, then louder with more conviction, "No, I do not." Harold stepped forward menacingly. "She's Reed property now, paid good money for her from her guardian after her parents died." Flynn's jaw tightened. "People aren't property, not anymore." The Civil War might have ended 11 years ago, but its lessons remained vivid in his mind. Chinese aren't people, Thomas sneered. Though Jenna's features clearly showed her mixed heritage, Flynn took a measured step forward. I'm not leaving without the lady, and I'm not looking for trouble. But I'll finish it if you start it. Harold lunged suddenly, but Flynn was faster. With a quick sidestep, he avoided the older man's charge and brought the butt of his revolver down on Harold's shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor with a howl of pain. Thomas hesitated, the belt hanging limply in his hand as he assessed the determined stranger with the steady gun hand and unwavering gaze. Jenna, Flynn said, not taking his eyes off Thomas. Gather what you need, quickly. Jenna didn't hesitate. She grabbed a small cloth bag from beneath the bed and stuffed it with a spare dress, a hairbrush, and a tiny photograph, the only image she had of her parents. From beneath the floorboard under the bed, she retrieved a small pouch containing the few coins she had managed to hide away. Margaret appeared in the doorway. You leave with him, you're dead to this family, she hissed. Dead to Hawthorne, no one will take you in. Jenna stood straighter, feeling a strength she hadn't known in years. I was never alive in this house to begin with. Flynn backed toward the door, keeping his gun trained on the Reed men. We're leaving now, don't follow us. Outside, the evening had deepened into dusk. Flynn quickly helped Jenna onto Mercury, then mounted behind her. With a kick of his heels, they galloped away from the Reed house, away from Hawthorne, and into the vast Nevada wilderness. They rode hard for nearly an hour, putting distance between themselves and the town. Jenna clung to the saddle horn, her body rigid with fear and uncertainty. Finally, Flynn slowed Mercury to a walk as they approached a small stream. We'll rest here for a bit, he said, dismounting and then helping her down. Are you badly hurt? In the moonlight, Jenna assessed her rescuer properly for the first time. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, kind eyes the color of the Nevada sky, and a beard that couldn't hide the strong line of his jaw. He wore the simple clothes of a working cowboy, faded denim, a cotton shirt, leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that he now removed, revealing thick brown hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. I'll survive, Jenna answered, wincing as she touched her bruised cheek. They've done worse. Flynn's expression darkened. How long? 3 years, she said softly. Since the day I married Thomas. And no one in town helped, Jenna gave a bitter laugh. The Reeds own half the businesses in Hawthorne. Thomas's uncle is the sheriff. Besides, she gestured to her face, most folks there see me as Thomas does. Flynn nodded grimly, understanding the prejudices that pervaded frontier towns. I'm Flynn Kavanaugh, he said, offering her his canteen. I have a small ranch about 2 days' ride from here near the Sierra foothills. Jenna Zhang Reed, she replied, then corrected herself. Just Jenna Zhang now, I suppose. Flynn built a small fire, careful to keep it low enough not to be visible from a distance. From his saddlebag, he produced jerky and hardtack. It's not much, he apologized, but it'll keep you going until we can find better. Jenna accepted the food gratefully. Why did you help me, Mr. Kavanaugh? Flynn sat across from her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. During the war, I saw too many people suffering while others stood by and did nothing. I promised myself I wouldn't be one of those who just watches. He didn't tell her about the nightmares that still haunted him, the faces of those he couldn't save. Instead, he asked, where would you like me to take you? Do you have family somewhere? Jenna shook her head. No one. My parents came from China during the gold rush. They had a small laundry in San Francisco, but it burned down with them inside when I was 16. I lived with my father's friend until he arranged my marriage to Thomas when I turned 18. Her voice caught. He thought he was securing my future. Flynn stared into the fire, contemplating. I can take you to Carson City. It's larger than Hawthorne. You might find work there. The thought of being alone in a strange city sent a wave of panic through Jenna. I don't know anyone there either. Or, Flynn said cautiously, you could come to my ranch for a while, just until you decide what you want to do next. He rushed to add, I have a small cabin separate from the main house where you could stay. You'd be safe and have time to heal. Jenna studied him, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but found only genuine concern. Still, she had learned the hard way to be cautious of men offering salvation. Why would you do that for a stranger? Flynn's gaze was steady. Because everyone deserves a second chance, Mrs. Zhang, and sometimes when the world has been unkind, a little kindness can make all the difference. As they sat in the quiet of the night, with the stars blazing overhead and the distant howl of coyotes echoing across the plateau, Jenna made her decision. Whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. I accept your offer, Mr. Kavanaugh, until I can find my way. Flynn nodded, a small smile softening his features. Get some rest then, we have a long ride ahead tomorrow. Jenna wrapped herself in the blanket he offered, and for the first time in years she slept without fear. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Flynn had kept watch most of the night, allowing himself only brief snatches of sleep. He was brewing coffee over the rekindled fire when Jenna stirred. "Good morning," he said, offering her a tin cup. "It's strong, but it'll warm you." Jenna accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his momentarily. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through Flynn, which he quickly dismissed as he turned to pack up their small camp. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Jenna asked, the fear evident in her voice. Flynn considered this as he saddled Mercury. Thomas might, for pride if nothing else. But not right away. He'll need to convince others to ride with him, and that might take time. "The sheriff is his uncle," Jenna reminded him. "Then we'll avoid the main roads and settlements," Flynn decided. "It'll take longer, but we'll be safer." They rode throughout the day, Flynn pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his time in Nevada. Jenna, who had rarely been allowed beyond Hawthorne's boundaries since her marriage, listened with fascination to tales of mountain passes, hidden valleys, and the wild mustangs that roamed the high desert. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a spring storm. Flynn urged Mercury to a faster pace, seeking shelter before the weather broke. "There's an old line shack about 5 miles ahead," he said. "Used by cattlemen during drives. We should reach it before the storm hits." The wooden shack appeared just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Flynn helped Jenna dismount, then quickly led Mercury to the lean-to at the side of the small building. Inside, the shack was spare but serviceable: a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a single cot with a straw mattress. "It's not much," Flynn apologized, lighting the oil lamp he found on a shelf. "It's perfect," Jenna assured him, relief evident in her voice as thunder rolled overhead. Flynn got a fire going in the stove while Jenna swept the dusty floor with a broom she found in the corner. The domesticity of the scene struck Flynn as oddly comfortable, considering they had been strangers just yesterday. From his saddlebags, Flynn produced beans and salt pork, which he set to cooking on the stove. "I hunt when I travel," he explained, "but the storm came on too quickly today." "I can cook," Jenna offered, moving to take over. "It's the least I can do." Their hands met over the cast iron skillet, and again that strange spark ignited between them. Flynn stepped back, giving her space, watching as she expertly seasoned the simple fare with herbs she found in her small bag. "My mother taught me to always carry a few spices," she explained, noticing his curious look. "She said they make even the plainest meal feel like home." As the storm raged outside, they shared the meal at the small table, their conversation flowing more easily than either expected. Flynn told Jenna about his years as a Union soldier, his journey west after the war, and how he'd worked cattle drives before saving enough to buy his small ranch. "I have about 50 head of cattle now," he said with quiet pride. "It's not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine." "Do you have family there?" Jenna asked, then immediately regretted the question when Flynn's expression clouded. "I had a wife, Sarah," he said after a moment. "She died in childbirth 4 years ago, our son with her." "I'm sorry," Jenna whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. Flynn nodded, accepting her sympathy. I have 2 ranch hands who help with the cattle. Good men. Manuel Rodriguez has been with me since the beginning, while Johnson joined last year. They live in bunkhouses on the property. The conversation turned to Jenna's life before the Reeds. She spoke of her childhood in San Francisco's growing Chinatown, of her American-born mother teaching her English alongside her father's lessons in Cantonese, of dreams she once had of becoming a teacher. Thomas promised I could open a small school in Hawthorne once we had children, she said, a sad smile playing on her lips. But that was before I failed to give him sons. You didn't fail, Flynn said firmly. No one can control such things. Jenna's eyes filled with tears. I had a daughter. She lived 6 days. Her voice broke. They wouldn't even let me name her properly. Thomas called her the girl until she died, then nothing at all. Flynn fought the surge of anger that rose in his chest. What would you have named her? The question surprised Jenna. No one had ever asked before. Lily, she said softly, after my mother. A beautiful name, Flynn affirmed. She exists in your heart, Jenna. No one can take that from you. Later, as the storm continued to lash the small shack, Flynn insisted Jenna take the cot while he made a pallet on the floor. I've slept on worse, he assured her when she protested. Many nights on hard ground during cattle drives and the war. As Jenna drifted towards sleep, lulled by the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof, she found herself studying Flynn's profile in the dying firelight. He was nothing like Thomas, not just in his kindness, but in his quiet strength, his lack of cruelty. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Thank you, she murmured, already half asleep. Flynn turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers across the dim room. Sleep well, Jenna, he said softly. Tomorrow will be better. And somehow, despite everything, she believed him. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind mud and swollen streams that slowed their progress. Flynn was acutely aware of the need to keep moving, to put distance between Jenna and anyone Thomas might send after her. The terrain gets rougher from here, he warned as they forded a creek that had nearly burst its banks. But it's the safest route. Few people travel this way. Jenna clung to him as Mercury picked his way carefully across the slippery rocks. Flynn was increasingly conscious of her arms around his waist, the trust she placed in him despite knowing him such a short time. By midday, they had climbed into higher country, with scrub pine and juniper dotting the landscape. Flynn called a halt near a rocky outcropping that provided shelter from the wind. We'll rest here, he said, helping Jenna down. Mercury needs a breather, and I imagine you could use one too. As they shared jerky and the last of Flynn's hardtack, Jenna asked, What will I do at your ranch? I don't want to be a burden. Flynn considered this. Can you cook? Jenna nodded. Very well, my mother insisted, both American dishes and Chinese. Then you won't be a burden, Flynn smiled. My men are tired of my cooking, and I'd be glad to pay you fair wages for kitchen work. Beyond that, we'll figure it out as we go. Something in his tone made Jenna look up sharply. Mr. Kavanaugh, I should be clear. I'm still married in the eyes of the law, even if I've run away. And Flynn raised a hand. I'm offering you safety and honest work, Mrs. Zhang, nothing more. Whatever happens beyond that is for you to decide when you're ready. Jenna studied him, then nodded, satisfied with his sincerity. Then I accept, and please call me Jenna. Mrs. Zhang makes me feel like my mother. Jenna, Flynn agreed with a small smile, and I'm Flynn. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they moved westward toward the Sierra foothills. Flynn pointed out a herd of pronghorn antelope in the distance, and later, the tracks of a mountain lion that had crossed their path. Is it dangerous? Jenna asked, eyeing the large paw prints nervously. Not usually to humans, Flynn assured her. They prefer deer and smaller game, but we'll keep the fire going tonight just in case. They made camp in a sheltered grove of aspen trees, their new spring leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. Flynn managed to shoot 2 rabbits, which Jenna skillfully prepared with wild onions she found growing nearby. As they ate by the fire, Flynn found himself studying Jenna's face in the flickering light. The bruises from her beating were fading to yellowish green, but they still marred her delicate features. Yet there was a resilience in her bearing that impressed him, a quiet strength that had survived years of abuse. "Tell me about your ranch," Jenna prompted, breaking his reverie. Flynn described the small valley where he'd built his home, the clear creek that ran through the property, the sturdy barn and corrals, and the main house he'd constructed himself with help from his hands. "It's not grand," he admitted. "Just 4 rooms in the main house. But the cabin where you'll stay is comfortable. Sarah used it as a schoolhouse when she tried teaching the local children. She was a teacher," Flynn nodded, a fond smile touching his lips. "That's how we met. I was escorting a wagon train west after the war, and she was bringing books to frontier settlements. She had such dreams for educating children in these parts." "She sounds wonderful," Jenna said softly. "She was." Flynn stared into the fire. "You remind me of her sometimes." That same determination. The comparison stirred something in Jenna's chest, not jealousy, but a strange sense of connection to this woman she'd never met. They fell silent, listening to the night sounds around them, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the occasional hoot of an owl. The vastness of the Nevada wilderness stretched around them, making Hawthorne and the reeds seem very far away. "Do you think they're looking for me?" Jenna asked suddenly. Flynn didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Probably. Thomas won't want to lose face, but we've taken a roundabout route. Even if they followed our initial direction, they would have lost our trail in yesterday's storm." "What if they find us?" Flynn's gaze was steady. "I won't let them take you back, Jenna, not unless it's what you want." "It isn't," she said firmly. "Even if I could never remarry, never have children, never have anything of my own, I would still choose this over returning to that house." "You'll have more than this," Flynn promised. "Whatever happens, you'll have a chance at a real life." Later, as Jenna slept wrapped in Flynn's spare blanket, he kept watch, his mind turning over the events that had brought them together. He hadn't planned to bring a woman, especially not a married woman, back to his ranch. Life was complicated enough tending cattle and managing his small spread. But something about Jenna's courage, her resilience in the face of cruelty, had touched something in him he thought long buried with Sarah. Just offering her safety, he reminded himself sternly. Nothing more. But as he watched her sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spilling over the makeshift pillow, Flynn knew he was already breaking that promise to himself. They reached Flynn's ranch late the following afternoon. As they crested the final hill, Jenna gasped at the sight spread before them. The small valley was green with spring growth, a clear creek winding through it like a silver ribbon. A modest but well-built house stood near a cluster of oak trees, smoke rising from its chimney. Nearby were a large barn, several corrals, 2 smaller bunkhouses, and set slightly apart a small cabin just as Flynn had described. "It's beautiful," Jenna breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Flynn felt an unexpected surge of pride at her approval. "It's home," he said simply. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, tall and lean, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of his Mexican heritage. "Manuel," Flynn called out as they rode into the yard. "Is everything all right?" Manuel Rodriguez approached, his curious gaze taking in Jenna. "All is well, patron, though we were beginning to worry. You're 3 days late." "Had a change of plans," Flynn explained, dismounting and then helping Jenna down. "This is Jenna Zhang. She'll be staying in Sarah's old schoolhouse and helping with the cooking." "Jenna, this is Manuel Rodriguez, my foreman and friend." Manuel removed his hat respectfully. "Senora, welcome to Kavanaugh Ranch." A younger man with broad shoulders and skin the color of mahogany joined them from the direction of the bunkhouses. Flynn introduced him as Will Johnson, his newest ranch hand. "Will was born free in Pennsylvania," Flynn explained later as he showed Jenna to the cabin. "Fought in the war, same as me, but in a colored regiment, best hand with horses I've ever seen." The cabin was simple but clean, with a small stove, a narrow bed with a real mattress, a table and chair, and shelves filled with books, evidence of Sarah's teaching ambitions. "The men and I tidied it last fall," Flynn said, sounding almost apologetic, "but it could use a woman's touch." Jenna ran her hand over the smooth wooden table. After 3 years in the Reed household, where she had never been allowed to make any space truly her own, the modest cabin felt like a palace. "It's perfect," she assured him. "I'll be very comfortable here." Flynn nodded, seemingly relieved. We'll bring water for washing. Dinner is usually at sundown in the main house. Take your time settling in." Left alone, Jenna explored the cabin more thoroughly. The books on the shelves ranged from primers and arithmetic texts to novels by Dickens and Hawthorne. A small trunk beneath the bed contained fabric, needles, and thread supplies for teaching sewing, perhaps. On one wall hung a simple cross, suggesting Sarah's religious nature. Jenna unpacked her meager belongings, arranging her spare dress and the few personal items she had managed to bring. The small photograph of her parents she placed carefully on the bedside table, positioning it so their faces would be the first thing she saw upon waking later. As the sun began its descent behind the Sierra Peaks, Jenna made her way to the main house. Flynn's home was modest but well-crafted, with a central room that served as both kitchen and dining area, 2 bedrooms, and a small study lined with books and maps. Manuel and Will were already seated at the large oak table, engaged in conversation about the spring calves. They stood when Jenna entered, a courtesy that surprised and touched her. "Please sit," she urged them. "How can I help with dinner?" Flynn emerged from the pantry with a side of bacon. "Tonight you're our guest. Tomorrow you can take over if you wish." That first meal at Kavanaugh Ranch was unlike anything Jenna had experienced in years. The men talked and laughed easily, including her in their conversation without awkwardness or condescension. Flynn explained the workings of the ranch, the seasonal rhythms of cattle raising, and their plans for the spring roundup. "We'll be branding the new calves next week," he said. "It's hard work but essential." "I'd like to help," Jenna offered. Will chuckled. "Branding is no job for a lady." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps not, but I can cook for the men who do it. I imagine you work up quite an appetite." Manuel grinned at Flynn. "I like her already, patron. Our stomachs will be grateful for the change from your cooking." Flynn laughed good-naturedly. "My cooking kept you alive all winter." "Barely," Will muttered with a wink at Jenna. As the meal concluded, Flynn walked Jenna back to her cabin. The night was clear, stars blazing overhead in a manner that made Hawthorne's skies seem dim by comparison. "Thank you," Jenna said softly as they reached her door. "For everything," Flynn nodded, suddenly awkward. "Will you be all right out here alone? The main house isn't far if you need anything." "I'll be fine," she assured him. "This is the safest I've felt in years." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then Flynn cleared his throat and stepped back. "Good night, Jenna. Sleep well." "Good night, Flynn." As she closed the door behind her, Jenna leaned against it, her heart beating oddly fast. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt the stirrings of hope, not just for safety or survival, but for something more. Across the yard, Flynn stood watching her cabin for longer than he could justify, even to himself. Life at Kavanaugh Ranch fell into a rhythm that Jenna found both comforting and liberating. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for Flynn and his men before they headed out to work the cattle. During the days, she kept the main house, tended a small vegetable garden she had started behind her cabin, and prepared the evening meals. Flynn had insisted on paying her a proper wage, which she carefully saved in a tin box beneath the floorboards of her cabin. It wasn't much, but it represented something Jenna had never had before independence. As spring deepened into summer, Jenna's bruises faded completely. Her body, once thin from stress and poor treatment, filled out healthily. Her face regained color and her dark eyes lost their haunted look. The change wasn't lost on Flynn. He found himself watching her more often than he should, noting the graceful way she moved around the kitchen, the quick intelligence in her eyes when they discussed books in the evenings, the musical quality of her laugh when Manuel told his outrageous stories. For her part, Jenna grew increasingly aware of Flynn's presence, the way he filled a doorway with his tall frame, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle way he handled even the most ornery cattle. She found excuses to bring him coffee when he worked in the barn, lingering to talk about his plans for the ranch. Neither acknowledged the growing attraction between them. Flynn was keenly aware of Jenna's married status, however unwilling her marriage had been. And Jenna, still healing from years of Thomas's cruelty, was cautious about trusting her own feelings. The annual summer roundup brought extra hands to the ranch, neighboring ranchers and their workers coming together to brand calves, mend fences, and share news. Jenna worked tirelessly, cooking for the expanded crew from dawn to dusk. On the third evening of the roundup, as Jenna served stew to the tired men, she overheard a conversation that froze her blood. "Heard there was trouble over in Hawthorne," a weathered cowboy was saying to Will. "Some Chinese woman ran off with another man, husband's offering a reward for information." Will, unaware of Jenna's history, shook his head. "Man ought to keep better track of his wife then." "Word is she was stolen, not ran off willing," the cowboy continued. "Husband's mighty upset." "Name's Reed, I think, Thomas Reed." Jenna nearly dropped the pot she was carrying. Flynn, who had been across the room, was at her side instantly, taking the heavy vessel from her trembling hands. "You all right?" he asked quietly, concern evident in his eyes. Jenna managed a nod, but Flynn could see the fear that had returned to her face. He guided her to the kitchen, away from the curious eyes of the other men. "Thomas is looking for me," she whispered, her voice shaking. Flynn's jaw tightened. "He won't find you here." "None of these men know who you are. But if they hear the description, they won't connect it to you," Flynn assured her. "To them, you're just my cook. Besides, most of these men have no love for Hawthorne or its people." Despite his reassurances, Jenna remained tense throughout the evening. When the last of the visiting hands had bedded down in the barn or ridden back to their own ranches, Flynn walked her to her cabin as usual. "I could leave," Jenna said suddenly. "Go further west, maybe to California." Flynn stopped, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted, "but I don't want to bring trouble to your door. You've done so much already." Flynn took her hands in his, a gesture more intimate than any they had shared before. "Jenna, listen to me. You're safe here. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be, home." The word resonated in Jenna's heart. This place, with its wide skies and open spaces, with Flynn's quiet strength and his men's easy acceptance, had indeed become home in a way Hawthorne never had. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hands. Flynn held her gaze, and for a moment, Jenna thought he might pull her closer. Instead, he released her hands gently and stepped back. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Tomorrow will be another long day." As summer turned to autumn, life on the ranch shifted focus to preparations for winter. Flynn and his men repaired buildings, stockpiled firewood, and prepared to move the cattle to lower pastures before the first snowfall. Jenna preserved fruits and vegetables from her garden, smoked meat, and made candles for the coming darker evenings. She had transformed the cabin into a true home, adding curtains sewn from fabric purchased in the nearest town, arranging wildflowers in jars on the table, and filling the bookshelves with volumes borrowed from Flynn's collection. On a crisp October morning, Flynn approached her as she hung laundry behind the main house. "I'm riding into Silver Springs tomorrow for supplies," he said, naming the small town 30 miles away that served as their connection to the wider world. "Would you like to come along?" Jenna hesitated. She hadn't left the ranch since her arrival 5 months earlier. "Is it safe?" "Silver Springs is big enough that strangers don't stand out, but small enough that trouble is rare," Flynn assured her. "And it's far from Hawthorne. Thomas Reed's influence wouldn't reach there." The opportunity to see somewhere new, to shop for supplies herself rather than relying on Flynn's occasional trips, was too tempting to resist. Yes, I'd like that very much. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Jenna dressed carefully in her best dress, the one she had mended, and altered to fit her properly after months of good food had restored her health. She pinned her hair up in a simple but elegant style, and added the small jade earrings that had been her mother's, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep hidden from the Reeds. Flynn was waiting by the wagon, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed. He stared at her for a moment as she approached, something in his expression making Jenna's cheeks warm. "You look beautiful," he said simply. The compliment, delivered without expectation or demand, touched Jenna deeply. "Thank you," she replied softly. The journey to Silver Springs took most of the morning, but Jenna hardly noticed the time passing. Flynn pointed out landmarks and told stories of the area's history, making the miles fly by. They talked easily, as they often did during evening meals or on the occasions when Flynn helped with her garden. Silver Springs proved to be a bustling town compared to Hawthorne, with a proper general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, and even a small dressmaker's shop. Flynn went about his business at the Mercantile, ordering supplies for the ranch, while Jenna explored the store's offerings. With her saved wages, she purchased fabric for new curtains, seeds for next spring's garden, a warm shawl for the coming winter, and after much deliberation, a book of poetry she had admired in Flynn's collection but which he didn't own. "A gift," she explained when he raised an eyebrow at her purchase, "for all you've done." Flynn looked as though he might protest, but instead nodded with a smile that warmed her more than the new shawl ever could. They took their midday meal at the hotel's small restaurant, a luxury Jenna had never experienced in Hawthorne, where the Reeds had kept her isolated from town activities. The simple act of sitting in a public dining room, being served by a waiter, choosing her own meal from a menu, felt revolutionary. "Thank you for bringing me," she said as they finished their apple pie. "This has been wonderful." Flynn studied her across the table, his expression thoughtful. "You deserve days like this, Jenna. Ordinary pleasures that most take for granted." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. Over the past months, she had come to care deeply for this quiet, honorable man who had rescued her without question and given her shelter without demands. But she was still, legally, another man's wife, a fact that created an invisible barrier between them. After completing their purchases, they started the journey home. The autumn afternoon turned golden as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the land. They were perhaps halfway back to the ranch when Flynn suddenly tensed, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "What is it?" Jenna asked, alarmed by his change in demeanor. "Riders," Flynn said tersely. "Coming this way." Squinting against the sun, Jenna could make out 3 horsemen approaching at a steady pace. As they drew nearer, her blood turned to ice. Even at a distance, she recognized the lead rider's posture, Thomas Reed. "Flynn," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "I see him," Flynn said grimly, halting the wagon and reaching for the rifle tucked beneath the seat. "Stay calm." The 3 riders pulled up about 20 feet from the wagon. Thomas sat rigidly on his horse, his thin face twisted with anger and satisfaction. Beside him rode Sheriff James Reed, his uncle, and another man Jenna recognized as one of Thomas's cousins. "Well, well," Thomas called out, his voice dripping with malice. "If it isn't the thief and my wayward wife." Flynn remained steady beside Jenna, his hand not quite touching his rifle but clearly ready. "Mr. Reed," he acknowledged calmly, "this is unexpected. Is it?" "I've been looking for my property for months," Thomas spat, his gaze fixed hatefully on Jenna. Had men watching all the towns around Hawthorne? When someone matching her description was seen in Silver Springs this morning, I was notified immediately. The sheriff nudged his horse forward. "Flynn Kavanaugh, you're under arrest for theft of another man's wife and interference in a legal marriage." Flynn didn't move. "There's no such law, Sheriff, and you know it. Mrs. Zhang came with me willingly to escape abuse." Thomas laughed harshly. "A man can't abuse his own wife, Kavanaugh." "The law gives me the right to discipline her as I see fit." "The law may," Flynn replied evenly, "but basic human decency does not." The third man, Thomas's cousin Edward, shifted impatiently. "Enough talk. Let's take them both back to Hawthorne for trial." Jenna trembled beside Flynn, memories of the Reed family's cruelty flooding back. If they took her back to Hawthorne, she might never escape again, might not even survive their discipline. "Jenna isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Flynn stated firmly, his hand now resting openly on his rifle. Sheriff Reed's expression darkened. "You threatening an officer of the law, Kavanaugh?" "Not threatening, just stating facts." Flynn's voice remained calm, but Jenna could sense the tension coiled within him, ready to spring. "Jenna is under my protection on my land." "We're not on your land yet," Thomas pointed out with ugly satisfaction. Flynn didn't blink. "Close enough." For a tense moment, no one moved. Jenna held her breath, acutely aware of how quickly the standoff could turn deadly. Flynn was outnumbered, but she had no doubt of his resolve or his skill with the weapons at hand. Then, unexpectedly, hoofbeats sounded from the direction of Kavanaugh Ranch. Looking past the Reed party, Jenna saw Manuel and Will approaching at a gallop, rifles ready. "Boss," Manuel called as they drew near. Everything all right. The arrival of Flynn's men shifted the balance. Now the Reed party was outnumbered and they knew it. "Your men have no authority here," the sheriff blustered, but with less conviction. "Neither do you, Sheriff," Flynn countered. "We're outside your jurisdiction. This is federal land, technically." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "She's still my wife." "A wife you beat and abused," Flynn replied, his voice hardening. "A wife who miscarried and lost a child because of your family's treatment." The accusation hung in the air. Even Edward looked uncomfortable, glancing at Thomas with something like doubt. "You have no proof," Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Flynn turned slightly toward Jenna. "Show them your back," he said quietly. Jenna hesitated, then turned and lowered the collar of her dress just enough to reveal the upper portion of her back, where permanent scars from Thomas's belt remained visible despite the months of healing. Sheriff Reed had the grace to look away. Edward muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. Only Thomas remained unmoved. "She's still legally mine." Flynn's patience visibly thinned. "Here's what's going to happen, Reed. You're going to turn around and ride back to Hawthorne. Jenna will file for divorce on grounds of cruelty. You won't contest it if you know what's good for you." "Is that a threat?" Thomas demanded. "A promise," Flynn replied evenly. "You see, while you've been searching for Jenna, I've been making inquiries of my own. About a Chinese laundry in San Francisco that burned down under suspicious circumstances, right after the owner refused to sell to a certain businessman with connections to Nevada mining interests. A businessman who later arranged his orphaned daughter's marriage to his business partner's son." Thomas paled visibly. "You're bluffing. You can't prove anything." "Perhaps not," Flynn conceded. "But I have friends in San Francisco who are continuing to look into the matter, friends with connections to newspapers that might find such a story interesting." The implication was clear. Even if Flynn couldn't prove Thomas or his family were connected to the fire that killed Jenna's parents, the mere suggestion of such a link in public would damage the Reed's reputation irreparably. Sheriff Reed cleared his throat. "Thomas, perhaps we should reconsider." "If the woman wants a divorce, she's my wife," Thomas insisted, but with less conviction. "Not for much longer," Flynn stated with finality. "And if you or any of your family ever come near her again, I promise you'll regret it." The standoff stretched for another long moment. Then, with a curse, Thomas yanked his horse around. "This isn't over, Kavanaugh," he spat. "For your sake, it better be," Flynn replied. The three Hawthorne men rode away, Thomas's rigid back radiating fury. Flynn waited until they were well out of sight before turning to Jenna, his expression softening with concern. Are you all right? Jenna realized she was shaking. The confrontation had brought back all the terror and helplessness she had felt in the Reed household. Yet somehow, standing beside Flynn, she had found the courage to face her tormentor without cowering. "I will be," she managed, her voice steadier than she expected. Manuel and Will approached the wagon. "Want us to follow them?" Manuel offered. "Make sure they keep going." Flynn considered this, then nodded. "Just to the county line. Don't engage unless they double back." As his men rode after the retreating Reeds, Flynn guided the wagon off the main road, finding a small clearing where they could rest for a moment. "Did you mean what you said?" Jenna asked as Flynn helped her down from the wagon. "About the divorce," Flynn nodded. "I have a friend in Carson City who's a lawyer. He can help file the papers. With evidence of abuse and the threat of scandal, I believe Thomas will sign rather than fight." "And the investigation in San Francisco, about my parents," Flynn's expression grew serious. "That part wasn't a bluff. I've had a Pinkerton agent looking into the fire since July. The evidence isn't conclusive, but there are connections that raise questions about Harold Reed's business partner at the time." Jenna stared at him in amazement. "You've been investigating all this time. Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to raise your hopes," Flynn admitted, "and I wanted to be certain before bringing it up." He took her hands gently. "Jenna, I promised you safety when I took you from Hawthorne. That promise includes making sure the Reeds can never threaten you again." The depth of his commitment overwhelmed her. This man had not only rescued her from immediate danger, but had worked silently for months to secure her permanent freedom. "Flynn," she whispered, unable to find adequate words for what she was feeling. He seemed to understand. His hands tightened slightly on hers, and for a brief moment he leaned forward as if to embrace her. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back. "We should get back to the ranch before dark," he said, his voice rough with restrained emotion. The journey home was mostly silent, both of them processing the confrontation and its implications. As the ranch buildings came into view, twilight settling over the valley, Jenna made a decision that had been forming in her heart for months. Once she was legally free of Thomas Reed, she would tell Flynn Kavanaugh how she felt about him. Until then, she would wait, hope, and continue building the new life his kindness had made possible. Winter descended on the Sierra foothills with a fury that Jenna had never experienced in Hawthorne. Heavy snows blanketed the valley, transforming the landscape into a glittering white expanse. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures closer to the ranch buildings, and daily life centered around keeping warm, tending to necessary chores, and waiting out the storms. Flynn's prediction about Thomas Reed proved accurate. The divorce papers, filed through his lawyer friend in Carson City, were returned signed and uncontested within weeks. The accompanying note from the lawyer mentioned rumors that the Reed family was selling their Hawthorne properties and moving east, apparently eager to escape the whispers that had begun circulating about their business dealings. On a snowy December evening, Flynn brought the official decree to Jenna's cabin. She invited him in from the cold, offering coffee and the apple cake she had baked that morning. "It's done," he said simply, placing the document on her table. "You're legally free." Jenna stared at the paper, emotions washing over her in waves: relief, vindication, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of possibility. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Flynn with tears in her eyes. "I can never repay what you've done for me." Flynn shook his head, settling into the chair across from hers. "You don't owe me anything, Jenna. Your presence here has been a gift to the ranch, to all of us." The way he avoided meeting her eyes when he said this told Jenna he wasn't being entirely forthright. Over the past 7 months, she had learned to read Flynn Kavanaugh's expressions, to understand the things he left unsaid. "Just to the ranch?" she asked quietly. Flynn looked up then, something vulnerable in his gaze that she had rarely seen. "No," he admitted, "not just to the ranch." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings that had grown despite their mutual efforts to maintain proper boundaries while Jenna was still legally married. "Flynn," Jenna began, gathering her courage. I want you to know that a sudden pounding at the door interrupted her. Will's voice called urgently, Boss, we got trouble with the North herd. The creek's flooding from the melt and they're stranded. Flynn was on his feet instantly. I'll be right there. To Jenna, he added, I'm sorry, this conversation will have to wait. Be careful, she urged as he donned his coat and hat. Flynn paused at the door, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. We'll talk when I return, he promised. The cattle crisis kept Flynn and his men out for 2 days and nights. Jenna watched anxiously from the main house as they worked tirelessly to move the herd to safety before the rising waters could sweep them away. When they finally returned, exhausted and half frozen, she had hot food waiting and warm water for washing. Flynn collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, accepting the coffee Jenna pressed into his hands with a grateful nod. Lost 4 head, he reported grimly. Could have been the whole herd if Will hadn't spotted the danger in time. You saved the rest, Jenna reminded him, setting a plate of hot stew before him. Now eat before you fall asleep at the table. He managed a tired smile. Yes, madam. That night, after ensuring Flynn and his men had eaten and retired to their beds, Jenna returned to her cabin. The divorce decree still lay on her table where Flynn had placed it. She picked it up, running her fingers over the official seal that proclaimed her freedom. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would tell Flynn what was in her heart, but the winter had other plans. A blizzard swept down from the mountains overnight, burying the ranch in drifts that made travel between buildings treacherous. For 3 days, Jenna remained in her cabin, venturing out only to check on her chickens and to bring wood in from the covered pile beside her door. On the 4th day, as the storm finally began to abate, Jenna heard heavy footsteps crunching through the snow outside. A knock sounded, and she opened the door to find Flynn, his broad shoulders dusted with fresh snowflakes, his face ruddy from the cold. Came to check on you, he explained, stomping his boots on the porch. Wanted to make sure you had enough firewood and supplies. I'm fine, she assured him, stepping back to invite him in. Please come in from the cold. Flynn hesitated, then accepted, removing his hat as he entered. The cabin felt suddenly smaller with his tall frame inside, more intimate than it had during his brief visits in the past. Coffee, Jenna offered, moving to the stove where her pot stayed warm during the day. Thank you, Flynn accepted, removing his heavy coat and hanging it by the door. Jenna busied herself pouring the coffee, acutely aware of Flynn's presence behind her. When she turned to hand him the cup, she found him studying the divorce decree which still lay on her table. I was reading it again last night, she explained. It still feels unreal. Flynn accepted the coffee, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. But it is real, he affirmed. You're free, Jenna. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Jenna gathered her courage and took a step closer to him. We never finished our conversation, she said softly. Flynn set the coffee cup down untouched. No, we didn't. I wanted to tell you. Jenna paused, her heart hammering. I wanted to say that living here these past months has meant everything to me, not just the safety or the work, but you, your kindness, your strength, your respect. Flynn's expression softened. Jenna, please let me finish, she pressed on. I know you still hold Sarah in your heart. I would never ask you to forget her. But I've come to care for you, Flynn, more than I thought possible after everything with Thomas. Flynn took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. Sarah will always be a part of my past, he said, his voice low and earnest. But these months with you have shown me that my heart isn't finished, that there's room for new beginnings. Jenna looked up at him, hope rising in her chest. What are you saying? Flynn reached out, gently touching her cheek with calloused fingers. I'm saying that I love you, Jenna Zhang. I have for months now. But I couldn't speak of it, couldn't even let myself fully feel it, while you were still tied to another man. The declaration, spoken so plainly, so honestly, brought tears to Jenna's eyes. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have since that first night when you stood between me and harm without even knowing me. Flynn's hand slid to cradle the back of her head, and slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his face to hers. Their lips met in a gentle kiss that held none of the demand or possession Jenna had known with Thomas, only tenderness and a question. She answered by wrapping her arms around his neck, drawing him closer, deepening the kiss with a certainty that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush you," he murmured. "After everything you've been through, you're not rushing me," Jenna assured him. "You've given me time, space, respect, more than I ever dreamed possible." "I know my own heart, Flynn." Flynn smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his weathered face. "Then marry me," he said. "When spring comes and the passes are clear, marry me and stay not as my cook or my employee, but as my wife and partner." Jenna's heart soared at the proposal, not just the marriage offer, but the promise of partnership, of equality. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Their second kiss sealed the promise, and as the winter storm raged outside, Jenna felt a warmth and peace she had thought lost forever. Spring came to the Sierra foothills in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. The ranch burst into activity as calves were born, fields were plowed for planting, and preparations began for the summer ahead. On a perfect May morning, with the mountains still snow-capped in the distance but the valley lush and green, Jenna Zhang became Jenna Kavanaugh in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who visited the area monthly. Manuel and Will stood as witnesses, along with several neighboring ranchers and their families who had come to know and respect both Flynn and Jenna over the past year. The small gathering celebrated afterward with a feast Jenna had prepared, featuring both traditional American dishes and Chinese specialties from her mother's recipes. As twilight fell, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. Flynn led Jenna not to the main house but to the small rise beyond the barn, where a single oak tree stood sentinel over the valley. "I have something to show you," he said, guiding her to the tree. At its base lay a small marker, lovingly carved from wood. "Sarah Kavanaugh," it read simply, with dates beneath. Flynn knelt beside it, pulling Jenna gently down next to him. "I wanted you to see this," he explained. "Sarah is part of my past, part of who I am, but you," he turned to Jenna, taking her hands in his, "you are my present and my future." Jenna's heart filled with understanding. "Thank you for sharing her with me," she said softly, reaching out to touch the marker respectfully. "And for making room in your heart for someone new." Flynn's eyes shone with emotion in the fading light. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small wooden object. He placed it in Jenna's palm, a tiny, exquisitely carved lily flower. "For your daughter," Flynn explained gently. "I thought perhaps we could place it somewhere special in remembrance." Tears spilled down Jenna's cheeks at the unexpected gesture. "Yes," she whispered, closing her fingers around the delicate carving, "that would be perfect." Flynn pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried not from grief alone, but from the healing that comes when loss is acknowledged and honored. Later, as they walked hand in hand back to the main house, their home now, Jenna felt a sense of completion, of having come full circle from the desperate woman who had fled Hawthorne nearly a year before. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, noting her thoughtful expression. Jenna smiled up at him, her heart full. "I'm thinking about that night you heard my screams and came to my rescue. How terrified I was, how little I dared hope for anything beyond escape." Flynn squeezed her hand. "And now I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best," she replied. "And about how grateful I am that you were brave enough to intervene when most men would have ridden past." As they reached the porch of their home, Flynn swept Jenna into his arms in a sudden, joyful motion that made her laugh in surprise. "Flynn, what are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he replied with a smile. "It's tradition." "Is it?" Jenna teased. "Or are you making that up?" "Would I do that?" Flynn asked innocently as he carried her into the house. Absolutely, Jenna replied, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him soundly. 1 year later, on a warm June evening, Flynn paced nervously outside the bedroom door as the midwife worked within. Manuel and Will sat at the kitchen table, attempting to play cards but too distracted by their boss's anxiety to concentrate. Sit down, patron, Manuel urged. You'll wear a hole in the floor. Flynn shook his head, unable to be still as Jenna's labor progressed. It's been hours, he muttered. Will dealt another hand of cards that no one would play. Babies come when they're ready, boss, not before. A cry from the bedroom made Flynn freeze, and then the midwife's voice called out, Mr. Kavanaugh, you can come in now. Flynn burst through the door to find Jenna propped up against pillows, tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. Flynn, she said softly, come meet your son. With trembling hands, Flynn accepted the newborn, staring in wonder at the tiny face with its shock of dark hair and eyes that, when they briefly opened, revealed the same blue as his own. A son, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He's perfect. Jenna smiled up at her husband, love overflowing. I thought we might call him James after my father. Flynn nodded, too overcome to speak for a moment. Finally, he managed James Kavanaugh, a fine name for a fine boy. As he handed the baby back to Jenna and sat on the edge of the bed, Flynn marveled at how far they had come from that fateful night in Hawthorne. From violence and despair to love and new life, their journey had been one of healing, courage, and the kind of deep love that transforms lives. Outside, the sun set over the Sierra Nevada, bathing the Kavanaugh Ranch in golden light. Inside, a family forged in adversity and bound by love began a new chapter in their story, one filled with hope, joy, and the promise of a future neither Jenna nor Flynn could have imagined on that spring evening when a woman's cry for help changed everything. As little James slept peacefully in his mother's arms, Jenna reached for Flynn's hand. Thank you, she said softly, for hearing me when I thought no one ever would. Flynn lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her palm. Thank you for being brave enough to come with me, to trust me, to love me. Always, Jenna promised, her heart full to bursting, for always. And in the years that followed, as the Kavanaugh family grew with the addition of twins, a boy and a girl, and the ranch prospered under their joint care, that promise remained unbroken. The woman who had once been beaten for failing to bear sons became a mother to 3 healthy children and a beloved wife to a man who valued her strength, her intelligence, and her heart above all else. The shadows of the past never fully disappeared. Jenna still had occasional nightmares, and certain sounds, a belt being removed, a door slamming too hard, could trigger moments of panic. But Flynn was always there, patient and understanding, holding her through the dark times until the light returned. Together, they built a life rich with love and purpose. Jenna eventually opened a small school on the ranch, teaching not only her own children but those of neighboring ranchers and the children of the ranch hands who came to work for Flynn as the operation expanded. Her classroom welcomed all, regardless of background or heritage, becoming a place where the frontier's next generation learned not only reading and arithmetic, but also respect for all peoples. Flynn, with Jenna as his partner in all things, grew the ranch into one of the most successful in the region. Their reputation for fair dealing and progressive practices, including hiring Chinese workers at equal wages when many refused to do so, made the Kavanaugh name respected throughout Nevada and beyond. And on summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Flynn and Jenna would often sit on the porch of their home, watching the stars appear over the land they both loved. Do you ever regret it? Flynn asked once, many years into their marriage. Coming with me that night. Jenna, her head resting on his shoulder, smiled in the darkness. Not for a single moment, she answered truthfully. You heard me when I thought I was beyond hearing. You saw me when I felt invisible. How could I ever regret finding such love? Flynn's arm tightened around her. I think perhaps we found each other exactly when we needed to. Yes, Jenna agreed, thinking of all they had built together from such painful beginnings. Exactly when we needed to. And as the night deepened around them, stars blazing in the vast Nevada sky, Jenna Zhang Kavanaugh said a silent prayer of gratitude for the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this place. This man. This life, a life transformed by courage, compassion, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds.